The vicar had asked if anyone present knew just cause why this man and this woman should not be joined, and Marianne Hartley had raised her hand. Not out of doubt, out of certainty. "I do," she said, and the church went the particular kind of silent that precedes a scream. "I have a letter from Mrs. Julian Pemberton of County Clare, dated the 4th of March, describing herself as this man's lawful wife these past 3 years. She had carried the letter folded against her ribs for 6 days, through fittings and rehearsals and her father's trembling gratitude that the debt would finally be settled, waiting for the one moment it could not be smothered, bribed, or explained away. Lord Julian Pemberton's face did the arithmetic in half a second, calculating whether outrage or flight served him better, and chose flight, shoving past the groomsman and out through the vestry door before the vicar had even lowered his book. 300 guests turned to stare at the bride, left standing alone at the altar rail, and Marianne understood, with the calm of someone watching a house burn from a great distance, that she had just destroyed the only thing standing between her father and debtor's prison, and that she had done it on purpose, and that she was not sorry. Her father, Sir Edmund Hartley, sat frozen in the front pew, his face gone the colour of old paper. The mortgage Pemberton held against their small Wiltshire property, £6,000, called in with a suddenness that had felt, at the time, like divine mercy when Pemberton offered marriage instead of ruin, would come due within the month, regardless of what happened at this altar. Marianne had known that when she raised her hand. She had done it anyway, because a false marriage brought no mercy at all, only a longer fall from a greater height. And she had rather fall now, honestly, than later, deceived. She had expected chaos. She had not expected the Duke of Ravenscar to be the one who crossed the transept toward her. Gideon Ashworth did not attend weddings he had no stake in, and Marianne knew precisely what stake he held. Pemberton owed him £11,000 in gaming markers, secured against the very Hartley property Pemberton had been marrying into. She had assumed the Duke came for Pemberton, to seize him by the collar before he vanished into Ireland. Instead, he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the muscle working in his jaw, and said, loud enough for the nearest pews to hear, "The license names a Hartley bride. It does not name the groom. I have a special license in my coat that says the same." He looked at the vicar. "Marry us now, or I marry no one. And this family owes £11,000 by Michaelmas." It was not a proposal. It was a transaction spoken like a threat, and the church, scenting a second scandal before the first had finished breathing, leaned forward as one body to watch her answer it. She had 6 seconds to decide between ruin and a stranger with cold eyes and a debt in his pocket. Behind him, she could see her father's hands trembling against his knees, and beyond the transept doors, already vanishing, the man who would have made a bigamist's wife of her within the hour. She chose the stranger. The letter had been the first thing anyone in that church learned about what kind of bride Marianne Hartley intended to be. What none of them yet understood, what she barely understood herself as the vicar's hands trembled through the second ceremony of the day, was that she had not surrendered the moment she said yes. She had simply traded one negotiation for another, and this one, unlike the first, she intended to win honestly. The Duke did not speak to her again until the carriage. "You could have shown me the letter privately," he said, watching the hedgerows blur past the window rather than her. "Handed it to your father. Let the marriage quietly collapse without an audience. Pemberton would have paid someone to make the letter disappear and married me within the fortnight regardless. He needed my grandmother's shipping trust converted to coin before his creditors caught the scent of Ireland. A quiet collapse would have given him a second chance. A public one did not." She folded her hands in her lap, steadying them by main force. "I did not do it for spectacle, Your Grace. I did it because it was the only version of the truth he could not buy his way out of." something in his expression shifted. Not warmth, but attention. The particular sharpening of a man recalculating an opponent he had underestimated. You knew 3 days before the wedding, and you let the rehearsal proceed. I needed the parish register witnessed, and the guest list confirmed. A private accusation is a rumor. A public one, in front of 300 witnesses, including 2 magistrates, is a fact no one can later unmake. She met his eyes for the first time since the church. I am aware that makes me either very brave or very calculating. I have been told I am both, usually by people who meant it as an insult. I do not intend it as one. He said nothing further for the rest of the drive, but she noted, with the same careful attention she gave to ledgers, that he had stopped watching the hedgerows. Ravenscliffe rose out of the Wiltshire dusk 2 hours later, grey stone and 100 dark windows, and Marianne understood, as the carriage rolled up the long avenue of limes, that she had married not merely a man, but an entire machinery of servants, tenants, and obligations she knew nothing about. The staff assembled on the steps to receive her with a formality that made plain no one below stairs had been warned to expect a bride that morning. A butler named Foss bowed as though duchesses arrived unannounced at Ravenscliffe every week of the year, and somewhere in the ranked footman, a maid's eyes widened at the sight of Marianne still in her wedding gown, veil discarded somewhere on the church floor, walking into a house she had never seen as its mistress. "You will want for nothing here," Gideon said, handing her down from the carriage with the same careful distance he had maintained since the vestry. "Mrs. Price will show you to your rooms. I have correspondence to attend to before dinner," and he was gone into the house ahead of her, leaving her standing on the steps of a stranger's home in her wedding clothes, married twice in a single day and alone both times. He did not touch her that first night, nor the second, nor the 10th. He installed her at Ravenscliffe with a competence that felt more like inventory than welcome, a companion engaged within the week, an allowance settled. Her father's markers bought outright from 3 separate creditors before she had thought to ask. When she thanked him for it, he looked at her as though she had misunderstood the terms of a contract. "I did not do it for gratitude. Pemberton is still in England somewhere, and a woman whose family owes money is a woman with a lever someone else can pull. I have simply removed the lever. That is the second time you have described me as a mechanism," she said. "I begin to wonder if your Grace has ever spoken to a woman as though she were a person." "Not recently," he said, and left the room before she could decide whether that had been an apology. Her cousin, Beatrice Wren, widowed 3 years and blunt as a hammer, arrived within the fortnight to serve as companion, and said what Marianne would not permit herself to. "He bought your father's debts, engaged your staff, and has not once asked what you take in your tea. That is not a husband, Marianne. That is a man managing a hazard." "He is grieving something," Marianne said. "I have not asked what. But a man does not build walls that particular height for no reason at all." She learned the reason from the housekeeper, in fragments, the way one learns anything true in a great house. His first wife, dead 6 years, of a fever that took her while he was in London, settling an inheritance dispute his own father had left deliberately unresolved as a final cruelty. He had returned 4 days after the funeral. The household still spoke of Lady Ravenscar in whispers, as though volume might wake something better left sleeping, and Marianne began to understand that the Duke had not married her coldly because he was a cold man. He had married her coldly because warmth, the last time he had extended it toward a wife, had been rewarded with a grave he reached too late to stand beside. The shipping trust her grandmother had left her, the very thing Pemberton had wanted, arrived by courier a week later, forwarded from her father's solicitor now, that the marriage made her claim uncontestable. Gideon found her at the estate desk with the ledgers spread before her, converting her grandmother's cramped handwriting into columns of freight and profit, with the ease of a woman who had clearly done this before. "You manage this yourself." It was not quite a question. "My grandmother taught me," she said. "A woman who cannot read her own accounts is a woman who will be told what she owns rather than knowing it." Marianne did not look up from the figures. The Bristol route returned £400 more than the agent reported. Either he is skimming or he is incompetent. "I have not yet decided which insults me more." Gideon crossed the room and looked over her shoulder at the columns, close enough that she felt the warmth of him along her arm. And for the first time since the church his voice held something other than management. "Show me." They spent 2 hours over the ledger, her pointing, his listening, and somewhere in the second hour she noticed he had stopped watching the page and started watching her hands as she worked. He had a habit, she realized, of running his thumb along the rim of his glass whenever he was calculating something he did not wish to say aloud, a small, unconscious motion he had repeated 3 times since sitting down, and she found herself watching for it the way one watches for a tell in a card game, waiting to know what he was thinking before he chose to tell her. He caught her noticing, and for once did not retreat behind management or debt. "You are cataloguing me," he said, not quite an accusation. "You have been cataloguing me since the church," she said. "I am only returning the courtesy." Something passed between them then that had nothing to do with freight or figures, and she understood, with a jolt that went through her like cold water, that whatever this marriage was, it was no longer only a transaction on his side either. The first crack came at a dinner 3 weeks later. 20 guests assembled beneath the long gallery's portraits of dead Ashworths, candlelight catching on silver Marianne, suspected had not been used since the last Duchess presided over it. Lady Torrington had installed herself at Gideon's right hand as though the title of hostess had never truly left her keeping, and it was clear within the first course that she intended to make Marianne feel the borrowed nature of her chair. She remarked over the fish course that it was fortunate the Duke had found a bride so conveniently already ruined, since a woman with nothing left to lose made so little demand on a man's conscience. The table went quiet in the particular way rooms went quiet around Marianne now, waiting to see whether she would fold. "I did not lose anything at that altar, Lady Torrington," Marianne said, setting down her fork with great care. "I gave up a fortune-hunting bigamist and gained £11,000 worth of leverage over him, which I intend to use. I would not call that ruin. I would call it the best trade I have ever negotiated." A ripple of stifled laughter moved down the table, and one gentleman near the foot, a colonel of Gideon's acquaintance, raised his glass to her half an inch in open salute. Lady Torrington's mouth thinned to a line, and she did not raise the subject again for the remainder of the meal. Down the table, Gideon's mouth did something that was almost, dangerously, a smile, and later that night, in the corridor outside her door, he stopped her with a hand not quite touching her arm. "You did not need to defend yourself at my table. I would have done it. I know you would have. That is precisely why I did not let you." She turned to face him fully. "You married me to manage a hazard, Your Grace. I will not also let you fight my battles for me. I did not survive Pemberton by being someone else's rescue." Something in him cracked open at that, some old certainty about what a wife was for. "My first wife let me manage everything," he said, low, the words costing him visibly. "I thought that was devotion. I have since wondered whether it was only that I never gave her room to be anything else." He looked at her a moment longer than was proper for a corridor. "I do not know what to do with a wife who will not let me manage her." "You could try asking her what she wants instead of deciding for her," Marianne said, and left him standing there with the candlelight throwing his shadow long across the wall. The almost came a fortnight after, in the estate's neglected orangery, where Marianne had taken to reading in the late afternoon light, because it was the one room in the house that still held some ghost of untended wildness. She had chosen it deliberately, the one room at Ravenscliffe that still smelled of turned earth rather than beeswax and formality, ivy climbing unchecked through a broken pane, a stone bench half swallowed by fern. It reminded her, in its neglect, of the person she had been before the church, someone allowed to grow wild, because no one had thought her worth pruning. Gideon found her there, with rain starting against the glass. And instead of leaving as he usually did when he found her in a private hour, he sat. "My wife used to keep this room," he said. "I let it go to seed after she died. I could not bear to walk past flowers she had planted." He looked at the tangle of green around them, at Marianne sitting in the middle of it, like something that belonged there. "You have made it feel less like a grave. I did not mean to trespass on it. You did not trespass. You simply are not afraid of it, the way I was." He reached out and brushed a fallen leaf from her hair, and his hand stayed a moment too long against her temple, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek with a care that undid every cold, managing word he had spoken since the church. The rain came harder against the glass. Neither of them moved. She could feel her own pulse in her throat, could see the exact moment his eyes dropped to her mouth, could feel the whole weight of 6 weeks of careful distance collapsing toward this single inch of space between them. And then Beatrice's voice came ringing down the corridor, calling Marianne's name. And Gideon withdrew his hand as though burned, and stood, and said something about the account books that neither of them believed, and left her sitting alone among the ferns, with her heart going like a struck bell, and the taste of an almost kiss she would remember for the rest of her life. The detonation came at the Ashworth Harvest Ball, the first grand entertainment Ravenscliffe had hosted since Lady Ravenscar's death, and the whole county had turned out to see whether the new Duchess could fill a room her predecessor had once commanded so effortlessly. Marianne had spent the afternoon rehearsing names with Beatrice, the Fitzwilliams, the Ashcombe twins, the elderly Marcus, who was rumoured to be nearly deaf, and answered every remark at twice the necessary volume, and by the time the first sets formed on the ballroom floor she had begun, cautiously, to enjoy herself, Gideon's hand steady at the small of her back as they moved through the figures of a country dance under the gallery's watching portraits. It was in the lull between sets, while Gideon was drawn aside by his steward over some matter of the tenant harvest, that a man Marianne had never met approached her with a folded document and a courteous bow, introducing himself as a solicitor retained by Lord Pemberton. "His lordship wished me to inform your grace," the title still startled her, 3 months married, "that the Irish marriage record you produced at the church has been formally contested. A witness in County Clare now swears the ceremony never occurred at all, that the letter was forged by a woman seeking revenge for a broken engagement. Should the contest succeed, Lord Pemberton's original claim upon you stands unbroken by law, whatever ceremony followed it." He smiled, entirely without warmth. "His lordship thought you would wish to know before it became the subject of common gossip rather than legal notice." The floor did not exactly tilt, but Marianne felt the whole shining room recalibrate around her, every waltzing couple suddenly a witness to a scandal not yet arrived. If Pemberton's claim held, her marriage to Gideon was never valid to begin with, which meant the trust, the estate, the £11,000, none of it settled anything. It meant she had built 3 months of something real on ground that might, by law, never have been hers to stand on. She found Gideon in the library an hour later, having excused herself from the ball with a composure she did not feel. "Pemberton means to unmake the marriage," she said, and told him everything. His face went the particular still that she now recognized as fury banked hard enough to look like calm. "He is bluffing." A forged witness statement will not survive a King's Bench challenge. It does not need to survive one. It only needs to survive gossip long enough to ruin me twice over. Once as a woman who lied at her own wedding, and once as a woman abandoned by a marriage that was never real. Her voice shook, finally, after months of steadiness. I did not lie, Gideon. I would swear it on anything you name, but I cannot make 300 people at that ball believe it faster than Pemberton can make them doubt it. Then we will not ask them to believe it. We will prove it. He crossed the room and took her hands, and for once there was nothing managing in the gesture at all. I have a solicitor of my own, and a shipping agent in Bristol whose ledgers your grandmother's trust runs through. And both of them can be in Ireland inside a fortnight, verifying the parish register Pemberton is so certain no longer exists. But I need you to stand beside me at that ball tonight, as though nothing has touched you. Because if you flinch, Marianne, he wins before the solicitors ever sail. And if the register has been destroyed, if he has already bought the silence he needs, then I will settle it a different way, he said. And something in his voice made clear exactly what kind of different way he meant, and for the first time she understood that the cold, managing Duke and the man who could not walk past his dead wife's flowers were the same man, choosing, deliberately, to become dangerous on her behalf. She walked back into that ballroom on his arm with her spine straight and her chin level, and when Lady Torrington asked, loudly enough to carry, whether the rumors of a contested marriage troubled her, Marianne smiled and said, only in that I dislike repeating myself. I told the truth once, in a church, at considerable cost to my own comfort. I am not in the habit of telling it twice, merely to satisfy an audience that did not listen the first time. It was not the crowd-pleasing moment yet, that was still to come, but it bought them the fortnight they needed, and 3 days later Gideon stood before her in the same library, publicly, with his own solicitor and hers and her father all present, and said, in front of witnesses whose testimony could never later be disputed, whatever the courts decide about the license, I will not annul this marriage, contest it, or set it aside. I choose this woman as my wife, by law if the law allows it, and by my own word, regardless if it does not. Her father made a sound like a man finally allowed to breathe after holding it a long while, and Gideon's own solicitor, a cautious man named Ferrers, who had spent the better part of an hour advising precisely the opposite course, closed his mouth and said nothing further. It was irreversible the moment Gideon said it, a public commitment that would cost him the very legal ground he was trying to defend if the courts ruled against him. And he made it anyway, in front of everyone who could later hold him to it. You did not need to say that in front of witnesses, Marianne told him afterward, when the room had emptied. A private assurance would have served the same comfort. A private assurance is a rumor, he said, echoing her own words back to her with the faintest edge of a smile. You taught me that. In a church, some months ago, I thought it deserved repeating. Beatrice found her in the corridor afterward, flushed and unsteady in a way 3 months of marriage had never once produced, and demanded to know what had happened. Nothing, Marianne said, which was true and also the largest lie she had told since the church. Beatrice, who had buried a husband and learned to read a room the way Marianne read a ledger, said only, and did not raise the subject again, though she watched Gideon with new and considerable interest for the remainder of the week. The cost came 4 days after, when the solicitors returned from Ireland not with vindication but with a delay. The parish register had been moved. The priest who kept it transferred to a different diocese, and Pemberton's people had gotten there first with enough coin to make the local magistrate suddenly uncertain of his own records. For 3 days it seemed the register might genuinely be lost, and with it any proof Marianne had told the truth. She watched Gideon during those 3 days grow quieter and more exacting than she had ever seen him. dispatching riders to 3 counties, sitting up past midnight over correspondence with a stillness that reminded her, unwillingly, of a man bracing for a second funeral. He did not manage her through it. For the first time since the church, he did not seem to know how to manage anything at all, and she understood that his composure, which she had once mistaken for coldness, was the only defense he had ever built against losing someone a second time, and that defense was failing him in real time. She did not weep in front of Gideon. She waited until she was alone in the orangery, among the ferns his first wife had planted, and there she finally let herself feel the full weight of what it would mean to be, in the eyes of English law, a woman who had invented a scandal to escape a marriage, to have her one act of courage recast as her one act of deceit. Gideon found her there an hour later, and did not manage her, did not solve it, only sat beside her in the wreckage of her composure, and said, "I believe you. Whatever the register says or does not say, I have believed you since the moment you raised your hand in that church, and I will believe you when we are both old and the courts have long since stopped caring." It cost him something to say it plainly, without armor, and she understood that his saying it was its own kind of wound reopened and offered to her anyway. The register turned up 2 days later, in the possession of a curate in a neighbouring parish whom Pemberton's solicitor had forgotten to bribe, an oversight born of exactly the arrogance that had undone Pemberton at every turn since the church. The curate, it transpired, kept meticulous duplicate records purely from a private horror of fire, and had done so for 11 years without once imagining the habit would matter to anyone. It mattered a very great deal now. With the register came something better than vindication. A second letter, in the same hand as the first, in which Pemberton's true wife, furious at being asked to recant her own marriage for money, had instead written a sworn account naming every estate Pemberton had mortgaged twice, and every creditor he had lied to, Gideon's £11,000 chief among them. Marianne read it standing in the estate hall with her father and Gideon both present, and it was she who insisted the account go directly to the magistrate rather than be quietly settled. She who sat across from the same 2 magistrates who had witnessed her wedding and gave testimony calm enough to make the room go silent with respect rather than scandal. When the magistrates finally caught up with him in the weeks that followed, Pemberton offered no defence beyond the truth, delivered without a shred of remorse. He had married in Ireland for a dowry that failed to materialize, and needed a second, richer one to escape the first marriage's creditors before anyone in England thought to ask questions. I needed the money more than I needed anyone to believe I had told the truth, he told the magistrate, as though the admission were a kind of dry wit rather than a confession, and it was the last thing of his Marianne ever troubled herself to remember. Pemberton was arrested, attempting to board a packet ship at Bristol 3 weeks later, and it was Gideon, standing at the harbour at Marianne's specific and insistent request, who watched her do it rather than doing it for her, the 2 of them arriving together, but only she stepping forward to the harbour-master with the sworn account in hand, saying, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "This is the man who tried to make a fraud of my marriage and a fool of the law. I would ask that this time the arithmetic be done correctly." Pemberton, recognizing her at last across the crowded dock, opened his mouth as though he still believed charm might purchase one final escape, and found nothing to say to a woman who had already beaten him twice, with nothing but a letter and the truth. Gideon said nothing at all, only stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back, close enough that she could feel him trembling faintly with the effort of not stepping in front of her. And the crowd that had once gathered at a church to watch her be ruined, now gathered at a harbour to watch her be, unmistakably, victorious, that night, back at Ravenscliffe. He came to her chamber for the first time since their wedding night, without a ledger or a solicitor or a single managing word between them. I have spent 6 years believing that if I never again let myself want someone the way I wanted her, I could never again be gutted the way I was when she died, he said, standing in her doorway like a man confessing to a crime. I do not know how to stop wanting you, Marianne. I have tried, for your sake as much as mine, and I have failed completely. And I am no longer certain I wish to succeed. He crossed the room and took her face in both hands, and this time there was no interruption, no rain-streaked orangery glass, no cousin's voice down the corridor. Only his mouth against hers, unhurried and devastating. The kiss of a man releasing a breath he had been holding for 6 years. And when he finally drew back, he pressed his forehead to hers and said, roughly, I did not marry a hazard. I married the only woman since her who has ever made me want to be something other than careful. And she answered him not with words, but by drawing him back down to her. The last wall between them finally, irreversibly, gone. The wedding, their true one, the one neither debt nor scandal had arranged, took place the following spring in the same small church, with Beatrice standing as witness, Sir Edmund weeping openly and unashamedly in the front pew, and even the deaf old Marquis declaring at twice the necessary volume that he had never seen a handsomer couple in 40 years of weddings. This time, when the vicar asked if anyone knew just cause why they should not be joined, the silence held nothing but relief, and Marianne, meeting Gideon's eyes across the same altar rail where she had once stood alone in ruin, thought that some things were worth surviving twice, simply to arrive at this. She wore, this time, a gown of her own, choosing rather than one selected to please a groom she had not loved. And when Gideon slid the ring onto her finger, his hands were perfectly steady, a steadiness she recognized now as its own kind of vow. Ravenscliffe itself had changed by the time the leaves turned again. The orangery cleared of its wildest neglect, but not tamed entirely. Marianne had insisted on that. And the shipping ledgers now kept in a study she shared openly with Gideon, rather than smuggled to a desk when he was occupied elsewhere. Foss no longer looked startled when she gave instructions to the staff in her own right, and Lady Torrington, on her rare visits, had learned to keep her observations about convenient ruin to herself. A year later, on the same orangery bench where he had first touched her face among the ferns, Gideon found her with a letter from Bristol, reporting the shipping trust's finest quarter yet, and a small daughter asleep against her shoulder. One small fist curled in the fabric of Marianne's gown. He sat beside them both, and said nothing at all for a long moment, only rested his hand over hers on the letter as the last of the afternoon light came gold through the glass, and when he finally spoke it was to ask, quietly, whether she remembered the 6 seconds she had once had to decide between ruin and a stranger. I remember, she said. I have never once regretted the arithmetic. Pemberton, they had heard, was serving a long sentence for fraud in a Dublin gaol, his name a byword in 3 counties for exactly the kind of ruin he had tried to visit on someone braver than himself. The orangery bloomed wild and unmanaged around them, precisely as Marianne liked it, and precisely, Gideon had told her more than once, as he had finally learned to like it too.